Thank you. Hi, everybody. The last speaking gig that I did about a week ago was a group of 88 military leaders around the world. So this is a much more comfortable kind of setting. That was about sort of why they shouldn't turn off the internet when people are making trouble. But I was thinking about, what might connect to some of the other themes that folks are thinking about at Wanderlust. And there's a lot of conversation here, I think, about bringing out your whole self, your whole person. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how the internet is increasingly, who the internet thinks you are, how it's thinking about you as a person, why that really matters, and what we might want to do about it to change some of the ways that personhood is conceived online. And I want to start by telling you a little story about some research that was done at Netflix. So these researchers were looking at what movies, how movies moved through the Netflix queue. And they noticed something interesting, which was that there were two really different categories of movies. You had some movies like, Iron Man, just zipping through the queue. People would put them in there. They would, get out to their houses in a couple days, and they'd be watching them very quickly. And there was another set of movies that would just, like Waiting for Superman, that would just take a long time. People would add them to their queue, and they would kind of get almost up to the point where people were going to watch them, and then they would, some other movie would take its place. People would be watching something else. And so they decided to graph these two clusters of movies. Let's look at all of the movies that, there's a very short amount of time between when people say they want to watch them and when they actually do, and put them over here. And all of the movies which take a long time and put them over here. So you can guess, the sort of categories of movies that were, that move very quickly. These are the romantic comedies, the summer blockbusters. These are sort of what they call the want movies. They're you get home from a long day, you just want to turn your brain off, and you turn this stuff on. And you can also guess, what movies are over here, right? This was, documentaries, French cinema, Holocaust movies. These are the movies that people feel like they ought to watch. We all want to have watched the great hits of French cinema, but right now we want to watch Ace Ventura for the 4th time. And what they realized was that there was actually something really interesting going on here. That this was kind of a tug of war between two inner selves. That there was a more impulsive self, that just wants to watch the romantic comedies, and a more aspirational, future-facing self. The one that's thinking about, sort of who do I want to be in 5 years or 10 years, and that wants to have, seen documentaries about issues that matter. And that what they were seeing was kind of this tug of war between those two selves. And, I think for a long time, great media has helped us kind of balance between those two selves. You get some information dessert, and you get some information vegetables. And that's the way that we, get to know about things that really matter, leavened with some stuff that's just fun and interesting to consume. But the way that the internet is thinking about who we are is changing that. And I think we could increasingly be moving into a kind of information junk food world. So let's back up for a second and talk about sort of the overall moment that we're in terms of the way that our society deals with information. There's a statistic that's kind of mind-blowing that Eric Schmidt, who's the CEO of Google, likes to talk about. And it's this. Let's say that you took all of the information created in human history, every conversation, every painting, every letter, you just take it all and digitize it. From the beginning of human history to about 2003, you'd have about 5 exabytes of data. An exabyte is like about 80,000 80 gigabyte iPhones, if you want to kind of picture it. 5 exabytes of data, huge amount of data. And the challenge that we're seeing online is that that same amount of information pours online every 2 days these days. Every 2 days, millions and millions of camera phone photos and texts and Facebook status updates and video chats. There's so much information. And so we need to find ways to filter through it, to find the things that are really relevant to each person. And so engineers have been thinking about this for a long time, and they came up with this kind of neat trick, which we're all familiar with from Amazon, which is if you like this, you'll like that. Right? If you like this book, you'll like that book. And it basically works in a fairly simple way. It says, we're going to look for people who have the same kinds of preferences as you, and then look at what else they like. And we're also going to look at products that other people who buy this product also buy. So, sort of, you can do it by looking at the person first or the product first. And what's interesting is that when you gather enough information, you start to not just be able to say, someone who likes The Lord of the Rings will also like, Harry Potter. You begin to be able to actually sort of skip domains. So you begin to be able to say things like, if you like wine with your meal rather than milk, then you're more likely to be socially liberal. It's true. Or another one I love, if your desktop is really cluttered with icons, that also correlates with being socially liberal. You can also draw these inferences between products that you never would be able to, that a person would never guess. So for example, one of my favorite ones from Netflix is, people who like The Wizard of Oz also like another movie, another very popular movie. You all can probably guess what it is. Of course, it's Silence of the Lambs. Strong connection between those two things. And so you start to be able to make these connections that a person wouldn't necessarily be able to see, and you start to be able to move between domains. And what that means is that there isn't necessarily a match between what you reveal to these services and what kinds of other predictions they're able to make about you in areas that you haven't revealed. So for example, there's a service called Hunch, which does this kind of personalization. And they can predict your sexual orientation based on totally unrelated data with about an 85–90% accuracy, just using 5 data points about you. Now, think about that. That's something that a lot of people have a lot of, they want to control how that is presented to the world. And yet these companies, by just getting enough data together, can start to know these things about you. And they don't necessarily have to tell you what they know. They can just show you ads that speak to these inferences. So the name of the sort of watchword in all of this is relevance. Relevance is kind of the new gold rush. How do we provide relevance? How do we engineer relevance? And the way that all of the biggest companies that control our experience on the web think about relevance right now is in terms of collecting this personal data and predicting what you're going to want to see. And I think when that comes to products, when it's Amazon, it's fairly innocuous. It's I find it helpful to see what books someone else who bought this book liked. But what we're seeing, which is more concerning, which really raises some questions for how we work as a democracy, is we're going from if you like this book, you'll like that book, to if you like this news article, you'll like that news article, to if you like this fact, you'll like that fact. And that's where things start to get dicey. Because the vision of these companies is to keep us, allow us to travel around in our own kind of personal information world. And there's a lot of things that are good about that, but at the end of the day, we live in one world. We live in the same world. And if we are too divorced from that, then we can miss the common problems that we all face. So, in my research about this, I sort of started to think about it as what I call a filter bubble. So, increasingly online, we are surrounded by kind of this membrane of filters everywhere that we go that know a fair amount about what our preferences are, about what links we like to click, and that are trying as best they can to show us the stuff that they think that we will like. And this isn't just on sites like Amazon. It's also on the New York Times. It's also on the Washington Post. It's also on Yahoo. It's on almost all of the major information services on the web. And it means that without necessarily our wanting it or even knowing that it's happening, we are increasingly living in our own sort of personally created information world. And the most striking example for a lot of people, I think, is Google. So Google used to be used to have this very democratic way of thinking about the web. Each page was linking to each other, and that counted as kind of a vote. And what it was this sort of amazing crowdsourced, bottom-up way of creating truth, or at least prioritizing links based on what everyone thought about what was the most important information. That's no longer the way that Google works. Two people can sit down on their computers and Google the same term at the same time and get completely different results. And when I first heard about this, I actually sort of almost didn't believe it. I almost thought, this seems like, it must be a very mild effect. So I asked a bunch of friends during the Arab Spring uprising to Google Egypt at the same time and send me screenshots of what they got. So, one friend sends me a screenshot. It's about what I would kind of expect. A lot of stuff about the Arab Spring, about the political context. 4 or 5 of the top 10 links, had something to do about politics in Egypt. Then another friend's email lands in my inbox, and I open the thing. And there's nothing about the Arab Spring in his view of Egypt. Nothing, not a word. Google had decided that he wasn't going to be interested in that stuff. And so what he saw was information about, here's when it's fun to go see the pyramids, which would have been a really interesting trip, like somewhat unexpectedly interesting had he gone. So, so we're moving into this world in which the web thinks it knows who we are and thinks it knows what we want, and is rapidly trying in every facet of our experience with it to kind of cater to our personal whims. And the danger here is in part, sort of a yes man phenomenon, that we're surrounded online by sort of toadies who just want to reflect back to us what is going to make us happy. And the reason for this is a commercial reason, which is that we can now see in the brain that people really love being presented with information that that validates what they already believed was true, right? There are these little bursts of pleasure that people get when they're told, you were so right. You really had it spot on. And conversely, when people are presented with information that challenges what they believed was true, we almost universally get cranky. That's just kind of part of the human experience. We don't like being told that we're wrong. And so if you're a web service that's trying to keep people coming back by giving them a great feeling about the stuff that they're reading there, why would you show people those bits of information that make them feel cranky? Why wouldn't you just show them the stuff with which they agree? But the other challenge here is that this whole thing is called personalization. But the ideas of what a person is that that it's based on are often really, really kind of shallow ideas about what makes a person. So I can't help but pick on Mark Zuckerberg, who, when he was asked about this, said that he thought that really everybody just has one identity and that anything else is an example of a lack of integrity. So the reason that Facebook is constantly trying to push everyone to make as much data about themselves public is because he doesn't really think that there's a difference between the way that people act with their friends or their family, with their colleagues, or with someone who's randomly surfing the web looking for their name. People should act in the same way. Now, this is sort of it's directly contravened by Mark Zuckerberg's own Facebook page, which if you go visit it is not actually very much about Mark Zuckerberg. But it's also, sort of in tension with the last 50 years of psychological research. And what is very clear if you look at human behavior is that the context that people are in and the situations that they're in and the kinds of people that they're relating to has everything to do with how they behave, with what kinds of information they reveal. We're not the same with everybody. And so if, this is sort of, we're trying to fit something much more complex and nuanced, human personhood, into a box on Facebook that just isn't, built to understand that nuanced complexity. So, the other piece of this that is developing is something that's called persuasion profiling. So a lot of what personalization is about has to do with sort of little bits of data. It's what you're deciding. This is about trying to identify how you make decisions and then pitch things to you in a way that you're going to respond to because you make decisions that way. And so the example is, some people really respond to, there's only 2 left. 2 left, get them while you can. Other people really respond to, the President of the United States says that you should buy this book, right? An appeal to authority. And other people respond to, your friends have bought this. And other people respond to, your friends haven't bought this. And if you know that about someone, then anytime you find them anywhere on the web, you can cater the way that you're talking to them to fit what kind of person they are and to fit how they're behaving. And so, in some ways, the websites that we're visiting know much more about us than we know about them. And it's not always evident to us what they know. So when people talk about, the kind of the techie folks that I often end up talking to, often say, well, this isn't really different. This isn't really new in human history. People have always lived in small towns and small tribal societies where everybody knew everyone's business. And we're just kind of in a way we're returning to that on a larger scale. It's like that small town sense of identity. Everyone knows everyone's secrets. But this actually is pretty different from small town identity. I grew up in a small town. And it's true, you know a lot about other people, but it's actually a reciprocal relationship, right? I don't know a lot more about everyone else in the town than they know about me. And that creates a kind of mutually assured destruction. I have an interest in keeping other people's secrets because they know a lot about mine. What we're seeing now is something much more asymmetrical. So someone can know, or a company can know a lot about you without you having any kind of trust or leverage or relationship with them. And that's really quite different. So the last piece I want to talk about and sort of how this is all constructed is really in some ways the most, the biggest turnaround as I was thinking about all this stuff. Which is that I actually am a great believer in the internet's power to bring people together to do good in the world and to help make the world a better place. And part of the story that most people like me, including myself for many years, buy into as part of that belief is that we've moved from a 20th century society that was all about sort of information gatekeepers, where in order to reach a broad public, you had to go through ABC or you had to go through the New York Times, and there was an editor or producer somewhere who was making those decisions, and often those people were corrupt or they were financially driven, and therefore people didn't get good information, and therefore when the internet came along and it swept them all out of the way, and all of a sudden everyone could talk to everyone, it was this amazing thing, and a new democratic era emerged, and everything changed. That's kind of that's the mythology about the situation that we're in. But I don't actually think that is the situation that we're in. Because there still are gatekeepers. There still are big companies that sit between, between me and the people that I communicate with online. And the difference is that instead of that gatekeeping happening with human editors that at the best of times were called to a sense of kind of civic responsibility, called to do something, to make sure that they were balancing the aspirational self with the more impulsive self. We have code, and the code doesn't pay a lot of attention to that distinction. The code sits in the same place, it makes the same decisions about what stories we see and what stories we don't see, but it doesn't think about how to balance those two wants. And so the argument that I get into with engineers all the time is they say, well, look, we're just giving people what they want. And I say, yes, but want is a really complicated word, right? Because we all want to be healthy and thin, and we all want to eat cake. And those are two real, sincere, true desires that we all have. So how you think about what people want really matters. And how you think about, and how much you take seriously people's longer term aspirations for themselves versus gratifying their short-term needs and desires really matters. Now, I think, hearing all of this, and I don't mean to be too gloomy, and I sort of feel like the gathering storm is, only helping underscore that. But I think there's a temptation with all of this to kind of turn away from it and to say, you know what, all of this internet stuff, it is reductive. It is, sort of flattening out our relationships. Let's just relate to each other in a more real way. And, I sort of think that's not a very satisfying answer either, because I think we will find our lives increasingly mediated by this stuff, whether we want to or not, for most of us. And certainly there are people who turn away from it, but for most of us, we will find our lives mediated by these companies. And I think it's much more important, actually, that we take the values that we have here about personhood, about what makes a whole person, about this sort of humanistic view of human society that says we're more than our most impulsive behavior, and make sure that that's actually represented in the way that these companies think about us. Because I think actually, what we have right now is something that's much more, sort of a function of things not really being thought through a whole lot, of things, of not very serious thinking about this stuff, than a sort of deliberate desire to flatten us out and turn us into, sort of a checklist of consumer desires. And so what I would say to all of y'all is, I think helping to push these companies to represent us all in a more full way seems to me to be, one of the really important things that we can all do. But the other thing is, I think we need to get better at communicating in a way that gets the information that matters through these filters that are being built. And that's sort of my new project, which is called Upworthy, which is about actually trying to find ways of building, we sort of think about it like information baby carrots, right? They're kind of junk food, but they're kind of good for you. And they make it through the filter of what people will click on compulsively, but then you actually get something out of this. I think a lot of the great media that is going to be definitional for the next decade is going to be stuff like The Daily Show that manages to find a sweet spot between informing people and entertaining people, and manages to enlist people in sharing the information that matters rather than just pummeling them with information candy. So I think the reason that I get very passionate about this is that I think we really actually need the internet to be as good as I sort of as many of us naively hoped it would be at the beginning. We need it to have that decentralizing, connective power. We need it to introduce us to new ideas and new ways of thinking. We need it to break us out of our little small towns and local neighborhoods and expose us to ideas across the world. And we need that not just because it's fun or it's interesting, but because actually if we want to solve the big problems that are in front of us as a civilization, I don't see how else we do it. If you take something like climate change, that's something that by definition is going to require lots of different people from different disciplines, different ways of thinking, different continents, different cultures coming together to find a common solution. There's just no other way you can solve something that big. And so, I think we need the internet to be as good as we hoped it would be. We need to not turn away from it. And we need to instead try to make it better, so that instead of ending up in this web of one, in a bubble, we can all use it as a tool to help create a better world. So thank you all, and I'd be glad to take questions and can talk about this or other move on of Oz stuff. Thank you.
One question. You spoke about the effort or the goal of pushing or influencing those who create filters to have other kind of set of values maybe or intentions in the way they create these filters. Do you think this can happen across the whole internet by some kind of raising the level of the quality of the filters for every filter out there? Or do you think this will happen more in a patchy way where some filters will still produce junk and others will actually raise the level significantly, and on average it will be better, but it will still be patched island type of situation?
I mean, I think already we see this. Already there are different kinds of tools that provide us with vastly different kinds of information. The thing that kind of got me going on this whole thread was I had actually made an effort to befriend conservatives, people who I disagreed with, on Facebook, and I just really wanted to not be hearing the same stuff over and over again. And I noticed that my conservative friends weren't showing up in my Facebook feed because Facebook had noticed that although I was saying that I wanted to hear from my conservative friends, I was actually interacting more with my progressive friends, and so it wanted to show me what I seemed to be wanting, and my conservative friends disappeared. And on Twitter, I still see my buddy Karl Rove's tweets, every time he tweets. He's not actually my buddy. So that's a different kind of filter. And I think part of this is about being much more conscious as individuals about how we construct the ways that information gets to us. Because it's possible, certainly, to be better informed than it ever was before. It's just as easy to read coverage of something that's happening in France from a French newspaper as it is from an American newspaper. But that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the way that people are using this stuff. One of my favorite quotes about this stuff comes from David Galerter, who's a famous computer scientist, who said, if this is the information age, what is it that we're so informed about? And I think we need to actually take steps as consumers to make sure that we actually are getting informed, rather than, as I was seeing happen on Facebook, just sort of fed back to us the stuff that we already know, but that's very comfortable to hear. Yeah, right here.
So you said we should direct our messages out there, Netflix and everything else, from impulse to aspirational.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering how to do that, because I do both. I do the silly movies, and then I do the big ones, the ones that everybody should have watched. but I still get like silly movies coming up more as my choice than the other.
Right. Yeah, no, so, and I'm not suggesting, I think there are very few people who, only do the aspirational stuff and they're mostly very boring. So I'm not suggesting that, you just do the aspirational stuff. I think everyone has a mix. I think, this is one of the challenges about how these filters are constructed on the engineering side. And I have these arguments with people where they say, we're watching what everyone's watching on Netflix, and we know that you watched 15 minutes of that documentary and then flicked over to, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure or whatever it was, and watched the rest of that. I think it's actually really important. In a way, that's about taking away agency from us, right? If you say, the only way to understand who someone is or what they do is to look at their behavior, you're taking away their ability to say, actually, I'm making a choice to focus over here. You need to listen to this choice. And that's what I think they need to be, they need to be much better about. I'll say since I've sort of been in this conversation with them, there have been some modest steps in that direction, but it's not anywhere near where I think it needs to be in order to really have it work. Yeah.
I was just wondering, along those same lines, are you doing something actively to edit your internet profile? Or, because I've heard stories of people trying not to use Google. I've heard stories that Target knows women are pregnant before they know that they're pregnant.
Uh-huh.
Is there anything for us to do personally, or it's almost, for me, I'm almost like overwhelmed. I'm like, well, what the hell? Let them know everything. I think it's either you're all in, you're all out in some ways.
Right.
You make all your. I don't really care. You can, to an extent, if they know that I'm watching Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure for the 10th time. Is there a way that you can edit your what information about yourself is getting online, or are they too smart for us?
Right now, it's challenging. I think we're in a moment where I think even these companies believe that the current equilibrium is kind of unsustainable, that the amount of information that they have and the power of having that information versus how consumers are expecting them to act, are really way out of whack. And it's only getting worse. Not to do another creepy statistic, but here's a really creepy statistic. Credit card companies can predict with a 95% accuracy 2 years before if a married couple is going to get divorced. And part of that is about obvious things like, are you renting hotel rooms in the same city that you live in? But part of it's much more subtle changes in behavior that happen that predictably lead up to that split. So, I think there are a lot of questions that are unanswered about sort of, does your credit card company owe you, should they be sending you a like, hey, we think you're on the rocks, message. I think there's a lot of questions about that. I would say, part of this is about what services you frequent. And again, there are services that are sort of better behaved and worse behaved. I would say Google and Facebook, their whole business is about vacuuming up as much information as possible about you. And, you sort of should reveal things to those companies advisedly because that's how they make money. They're sort of free services, but the data that you're handing isn't free to them. It's actually very valuable to them. Something like Twitter has a very different business model and doesn't care as much about knowing who you are. That's why you can sign up for Twitter with a fake name and address and everything, and it's fine by them. So I think that's, if you don't want to be seeing things through a lens that reflects these companies' kind of flattened out hypothesis of you, Twitter's a better, I would say Twitter's a better, source than Google or Facebook. In the back here.
Thank you so much for coming. I've really enjoyed this. So in the same lines of us giving big companies, some of the biggest companies information that we frequent all the time, do you think that the current state of privacy, information privacy, is where it should be? And if not, where do you see it going?
Yeah. So did everyone hear the question? It was basically, is the current state of information privacy, where it should be? I definitely don't think so. I think, for me, the data that I have in bits and bytes is actually becoming some of my most precious property, right? The photos that I have, the documents that I wrote, all of my college papers, the law really hasn't caught up with that fact or given me the rights in that data that I really need. So I think that's there does need to be a reset where people are much more in control of the data that they reveal to these companies, and especially what these companies reveal to other companies, right? Because it's one thing if I say, you know what, I'm going to give you a bunch of information about myself and you'll give me a better service. But it's another thing if that company then goes and says, hey, everyone else, here's what we know about Eli. We're going to sell that information many times over for free. That seems like a problem to me. One of the most interesting proposals about this that I just heard from a prominent venture capital guy who's concerned about it is, basically allowing people to read and write from the personal data that any company has about them. So it's saying, basically, I can take it out at any time. I can see what you are tracking about me. I can move it to another company. I can write over it with other data. It's a very interesting proposal because it creates a lot more leverage for, sort of one of the challenges with Facebook is it's like there's no alternative. You just have to use Facebook or you're not going to have a social network with your friends. This would allow someone to say, yeah, we're actually going to pull all your data out of Facebook and allow you to have another way of looking at that data in another company that maybe takes your privacy more seriously. Again, I think part of my concern is that this stuff, it's wonky, it's a little technical, but it's also the sort of heart of, as we move online, as we become citizens of this new world, we have these kind of responsibilities to actually shape it in the way that actually serves all of us. And so I think understanding all of this stuff and getting involved in helping to shape it is really important. And we saw recently with SOPA and PIPA, that when people actually do step up and do say, hey, I don't want the online world to look this way, that sometimes even the biggest companies in the world are powerless to actually stop them. And so I think part of what this whole shtick is about is kind of trying to get more people to think of themselves as digital citizens rather than as sort of serfs in a kingdom that they don't control and they don't really like the king, but they don't have any power over. Yeah, right back here, and maybe we'll take one more or something.
That's actually kind of a perfect segue into my question, which is the thing about this space that the development that's most concerning to me is the development of like the national voter files and how companies are now integrating that database, our actual political, our existence as actual citizens with the commercial databases, and that there's this gold rush mentality of that this is really, there are all these cool and awesome opportunities that you can do when you merge somebody's social profile and their commercial profile and their voting profile. And no one seems to be taking it seriously like that. This is, profoundly, this roots, very deeply into the heart of our democracy. And I don't know if you've been following this or have any reason for hope on that.
Yeah, I think it cuts a number of ways. I mean, I think, so with my Move On hat on, when you're an organization with limited resources, totally funded by members, trying to figure out how do we make an impact in an election, it is very helpful to be able to say these are the people who are the most, who, if you want to get them out to vote, they're the most likely to be persuaded by you, and they're the most likely to come out. And to some degree, I think when that stuff is used to increase turnout, I think that's kind of, I want people to be turning out. I want people to be engaging. I think what worries me much more is when you go to persuasion, and when you think about this kind of fracturing of the media and different people hearing different messages and getting different targeted ads, it really changes the way that political conversation works. So, I never thought I would be up here kind of defending the classic obnoxious, awful political ad on TV, but at least with the classic obnoxious, awful political ad, when one candidate says something, they're saying it to the whole, to a large group of the people, and then the other candidate can go to that same forum and respond to that same group of people and say, so-and-so lied, and they, here's the real facts. And it's a really awful way of having a conversation, but at least it's a conversation. When you move into this targeted world where people are saying, okay, here's Eli, he fits this Democratic profile, we're going to hit him with this one, sort of salacious rumor that we think would be really great for people like him. The other candidate may not know that that's happening. They may not have any ability to respond because they don't know to whom it was said. And you lose whatever discursive quality existed. And so I think that's really, really problematic. And I think actually there's a simple solution that I'm trying to find someone who will champion, which is just if you had a website where every public communication that every campaign did had to be posted, here's just every ad, it would solve some of those problems because then you would sort of at least be saying it in front of journalists who could watch what you were doing. Right now, journalists, I can target people online in a way that actually targets around anyone that's a journalist. There's a funny, sorry for the digression, but my favorite online ad targeting story, which shows what kind of person I am, is this company was doing stuff that was blatantly against Facebook's advertising rules. And if Facebook saw it, they would shut them down in a second. So what they did was they just blocked Facebook's IP, the zip code that all of the Facebook employees were in from seeing the ads that were breaking the rules. And so Facebook didn't notice for like a year and a half because they never saw those ads. That's sort of the challenge here. That we're not all seeing the same thing, and so that some of the responsiveness doesn't happen. So let's do one more question, and I'm happy to stick around and chat with anyone else. But yeah, right here.
So given all that you've talked about so far, cloud storage, yes or no? Would you put things up there personally now, in the future, and what's your recommendation for us?
So the question was cloud storage, which is, I'm putting stuff on Google server somewhere or Amazon server somewhere. I do that. I do it kind of knowing that I'm giving up a bunch of rights when I do. One of the really interesting things is that in order for the FBI to search your home computer, they need a warrant. But they don't need a warrant in order to search your cloud storage. That's something that they can just go direct to those companies with. Now, I don't have anything in particular that I don't want the FBI to search, but you do actually give up a lot of rights when you're in cloud storage. And then the other piece is, again, to the sort of question of how do you create space for these civic conversations online, I think it is dangerous when kind of the place for discourse is owned by a few big companies. And we saw this with WikiLeaks, which I have mixed feelings about WikiLeaks, but I definitely think that when Amazon, under pressure from the US government, basically took down their ability to have a website because they decided that this wasn't the kind of stuff that they wanted on their servers. And what that meant was that there was actually nowhere where you could find the WikiLeaks data that the New York Times had because, because no one was willing to host them, because all of these companies were concerned about their relationship with the government. That is really concerning, and I think Amazon should have gotten more flack for that than they did, and I think it's sort of one of the questions around this kind of commercialization of online space. Awesome, thank you so much, and great to talk.